Alors, nous allons reprendre. Pour écouter notre dernier conférencier. Donc, Steve Robertson, qui est professeur et co-directeur du Centre for Men's Health à l'Université Leeds, Beckett, en Angleterre. Il traitera des hommes, masculinités et le travail de promotion de la santé. Il va faire l'état actuel des choses. M. Robertson a travaillé au sein du National Health Service au Royaume-Uni pendant plus de 20 ans avant de se lancer dans le domaine de la recherche. Ses intérêts et publications portent sur les théories sociales de la masculinité et leur application à des aspects de la santé et de promotion de la santé. Il possède une vaste expérience en ce qui a trait à l'évaluation de programmes d'intervention de promotion de la santé des hommes. M. Robertson compte plus de 50 publications revues par les pairs dans le domaine et est l'auteur du texte « Understanding Men and Health » en 2007. Il a aussi agi en tant que consultant sur le genre et la santé des hommes par le ministère de la Santé britannique et l'OMS. Il a déclaré aucun conflit d'intérêt ni d'apparence de conflit d'intérêt. Donc, accueillons M. Robertson.
Thank you. I'm not sure what she said, but I'm hoping it was nice. Or at least truthful. I apologise. I'm English, so as with most English people, we're very poor with languages. So you'll have to put up with me talking in English. A lot of people say that I can't really even do that very well. So hopefully I'll give it a go, and we'll see how we get on. The interesting thing about talking at the end of a day is that it gives you the opportunity to try and tie things together. And it's been a really interesting day. And I think a lot of things that have been said will be picked up again in my presentation. The other interesting thing about talking at the end of the day is it gives you a chance to say really bad things about anything that anyone else has said during the day. So we'll see how that goes. What I want to do in the time that I've got is try and do two things. One is to give a little bit of a history about where we started in men's health promotion work, a lot of the lessons learnt over the last 20 years, and then in the second part of the talk, which will be a bit shorter, is to try and point out some of the things that we know about what works. And that mainly comes from two studies that we carried out in Leeds. So that's the aim. Map a little bit of the history of men's health promotion work over the last 20 years and what we've learnt, and then present some overarching findings about what elements seem to work best in health promotion work with men. And some of that we've already heard about today. So where did it all begin? Back when I started in this field in the mid-1990s, there was quite a simplistic view articulated about men, masculinity and health. And that was really one that painted quite a negative picture. It tended to paint a view of all men as risk takers, as irresponsible. They engaged in more bad behaviours, so they smoke more, drink more, take more drugs, engage in more acts of violence. And this was the sort of rhetoric that was around in the mid-90s when people like myself and John MacDonald and John Olive and others started out in the field. And it was really linked to two ideas about men. One was whether or not it was linked to their biology. So is it innate? Is it part of men's genetic makeup that this is how they are? And the other thing it was often linked to was what we've heard a bit about today, which is role theory. So is it about the fact that the roles that men are expected to play in society lead them to drive themselves very hard, and as a result become very stressed and therefore utilize things like smoking, drinking, as a way to manage their stress. And that both of those models really, I think, restrict what it is that we can achieve. If it's biologically driven, then there's nothing that we can do about it. If it's all about roles in a very fixed way, again, there's very little that we can do about that. So a lot of us began thinking that it was perhaps more than that. So the model back then was that masculinity makes men what they are, which is pretty naughty and bad, and that in turn impacts on their health in terms of poorer life expectancy and higher rates of morbidity. But I think we've learnt a lot since then. I hope we've learnt a lot since then. I hope, like John MacDonald was talking about this morning, that we don't just have such a negative view about men and masculinity and the role that that plays in relation to health. So what are some of the things that I think we've learnt? I think firstly, one of the most important things is that men are not a homogenous group. So even the phrase men's health, personally I find quite problematic, because men's health tends to suggest that all men are the same by its very nature, and they're not. I think John Olive before did a very good job of talking about the plurality of men and the plurality of masculinities. So why is it important? It's important because the health needs and requirements of a man, say, who's an Indigenous Canadian in his 80s are going to be very different than the health needs of a 20-year-old white British man, for example. So if we think of men's health in a very homogeneous way, again, it restricts what we can do. We'll try and develop a one-size-fits-all model to address men's health needs, and that will never work. It's also important because, as I think it was Ryan earlier pointed out, that there's often more similarities than differences when we think of men and women's health behaviours, practices and outcomes. You know, most of the studies, as he pointed out, don't show a lot of statistically significant differences, and I'll come back to that shortly. So to talk about men's health runs the risk as well of creating an unnecessary binary between men and women, which can get us into a situation where we begin to compete for resources. So the idea that men's health is worse than women's health can often be used as a lever to try and generate more resources, and that's a problematic and unnecessary competitive way of dealing with men in terms of health promotion. So thinking of that example of why it's important to recognise that men are not all the same, this is some work that we undertook in an area of London in the UK, and we did some survey work looking at 4 aspects of lifestyle, so inactivity, smoking, poor diet and alcohol. And we looked at that in different groups of men, so unemployed men, divorced and separated men, and then all the men in the survey. And you can see that the patterns are quite different, not always what you'd expect, but smoking, for example, you know, is almost twice as high in unemployed men as it is compared to all the men that were surveyed. Likewise, drinking, way higher amongst divorced and separated men, but actually a little bit lower with unemployed men. So these things become important when we're thinking about how, when, where and why to develop our services for men. This is why it's important to recognise that men are not a homogenous group. I'll skip over that slide. Within this idea that men are not homogenous is also another important element, which is that men, even in themselves, are contradictory. The same man does not act the same way Tell them we're not in. The same man doesn't act the same way in different social contexts. When I go out drinking tonight with John Olive, I'll probably act in quite a different way than I will when I'm stood here speaking in a seminar. And that's not because one way of me being is real and the other is false. It's a natural part of human nature that you engage and function differently in different contexts. So again, when we're thinking about health promotion work with men, we need therefore to be thinking about what are the contexts that bring about the sort of practices that we want men to engage in, and what are the sort of contexts that it's very, very difficult for men to engage in positive practices. This is one of my pet subjects. Anyone who's known me for any length of time knows that I just get incredibly bloody irritated when people talk about men not going to the doctors. It's a myth. It's not backed up by empirical evidence. Let's have a quick look at what we do know. I like this cartoon. Maybe they should have come a bit earlier. So this idea that men delay seeking help, I think, needs challenging. If we take a very simplistic view that men don't seek help, we're missing out on a more nuanced and careful understanding of when men do and don't seek help. So what do we know? Figures for primary care. So consultations with GPs and other primary care practitioners. Clearly there's a marked differences, but the marked differences are in a very specific age group, 16 to 64. Outside of that age range, the differences are really not that great at all. We know a lot about why those differences are like they are in that age group. The vast majority of that difference is to do with two things. It's to do with reproductive screening that's available to women, and it's to do with men's lack of engagement around psychosocial concerns. Let's have a look at some of the reasons, the differences in what would prompt men and women going to the GP. If you look down that list, there's not many areas where there's a great difference. There's a few where there are. The first one, going down from the top, I've circled the ones that I think stand out. So the first one is about new lumps. Well, clearly, given all the emphasis that's correctly put on breast cancer recognition and breast lump recognition, of course there's going to be a difference in going to the doctors for new lumps. Feeling ill for 3 to 5 days. Who would that prompt to go to the doctor? Men more than women, interestingly. Discharge, more women than men. Not surprising, given differences in physiology and anatomy and menstrual cycles. Pressure from partner to go, more men. Interesting. I wonder how much of that is rhetorical rather than real, that men need to legitimate going to the doctor. And one of the ways that they legitimate it is to say, my partner made me come. Diarrhea and sickness. More men would be prompted to go. And the last one is feeling ill for more than 1 to 3 days. More men would go. So that on that basis, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of evidence that men delay seeking help more than women. But that's self-reported. So let's have a look at some more empirical work that's done by good friends of ours up in Glasgow. So this was to do with cancer diagnosis, and the bit to read really is the bit in bold. Patterns of consulting prior to cancer diagnosis differed little between the two genders. In other words, men were not delaying seeking going for help for cancer symptoms. Maybe it's just to do with cancer then. Well, actually not. So this is more work from Glasgow. This was a study that looked at 5 major condition types, so cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal disease, and other condition types. What it found, women were no more likely to go than men to consult a GP. In addition, women were no more likely than men to consult at a given level of severity for a condition type. In other words, for the same level of symptom, there's no statistically significant difference in engagement. But perhaps this is just unique to Glasgow or the UK. Well, no, because some work by a guy called Paul Galdas, he did a meta-review of sex differences in consultation and came up with the view that that review of gender comparative studies doesn't support the hypothesis that men are less likely than women to seek help when they experience ill health. When they experience ill health. It goes for Australia as well, so this was some work from Australia. The findings suggest that men and women identify that they have need for formal health care at similar levels of self-assessed ill health. So the issues come not when symptoms are presenting. The issues come for services that are much more to do with promoting and maintaining health. That's where the difference lies. The other area where the difference definitely lies is to do with mental ill health. There's very strong evidence for sex differences in consultation for psychosocial concerns. Paper after paper, I haven't put any here, we've seen some of them earlier in the day. There's a lot of evidence for sex differences in consultation for psychosocial and mental health concerns. So men do go to the doctors. Please stop saying that men don't go to the doctors. So one of the other lessons that we've learned is that men face a bit of dilemma in relation to health, and John Olive alluded to this earlier. So some of the work that I did some time ago looked at this dilemma that men face. So on the one hand, men as men are not meant to care about their health and well-being. Health and well-being is a feminized concern in public discourse. So men are not meant to care about their health and well-being. On the other hand, as good citizens, we're all expected to show that we do care about our health and well-being and to act in ways that show that we care. So this is a real dilemma that men face, much more than women. Women are allowed, in terms of public discourses, to do health for its own sake. Men aren't. And what that means is that they have to find ways to legitimate engaging with health more than women do. I love this quote. This was a quote from some work I did back in about 2004. And this guy, Frank, he's presenting this dilemma. And he's saying, if there was a salad I didn't enjoy and a burger that I would enjoy, I'm sorry, but I'd eat the burger. Enjoy your life. But I think you have to be a bit careful and sensible. You can't be totally brash. You have to be sensible and responsible to a point. There's a point, and once you get past that point, you're being silly again. Some people are too careful. That's not me. You've got to get it right. And you can just see in that narrative, he's completely oscillating between two positions. I care, but I don't care too much. But I do care. And you can see this dilemma being played out. And this also links to something else that John Olive mentioned earlier, this notion of masculine capital. So masculine capital is about the social and material advantages that are gained through engaging in traditionally male behaviours. And there's been some fantastic work done by a guy called Richard Deviser, who's based in London. And what he talks about is the way that certain forms of masculine capital can be exchanged for others. So one of the examples that he gives, if there's a guy who is a top-level sportsman, or is getting towards being a top-level sportsman, he can go out with his mates and he can not drink. And the reason that he gives for not drinking is that he's got a game to play tomorrow or that he's training for a particular event, and that's okay. So he's substituting one form of masculine capital for another to offset what he's doing. And this is another way that we have to think about the context of men's lives. And it's another way in terms of health promotion work that we may be able to encourage and engage men and facilitate men engaging in different ways if we can provide them with different forms of capital, masculine capital, in order to get them to change practices and behaviours in another area. So this was an example from some work that we did looking at promoting health through football, or soccer, as you guys call it. You've got a fantastic women's soccer team here, by the way. Excellent. So this was a guy who was interviewed who'd been through one of the projects in the UK. And he says, for a few weeks, my mate was telling me that he was coming to some football thing, and it's enjoyable. You learn stuff, it gets you fit. You get better at football. It helps you lose weight and cut down on smoking. So for weeks and weeks, I was like, I don't know. Then he said, it's run by Manchester United coaches. I'm a United fan myself. I love United, and I thought, why not? So he was engaged in the project through a form of masculine capital. The links with sport and football allowed and legitimated his engagement in the project. So he could say to his friends, of course I'm going down. You know, it's run by Man United coaches. Why wouldn't I go down? Okay, a fourth lesson learnt, and again we've heard a bit about this today, is that health providers' views of masculinity have an impact on engagement. Those of you who are or are hoping to become practitioners, this is important, and I know a few people have already spoken about this today. So, what do we know? We know that men receive less time than women in consultations with doctors, and explanations that are given are fewer in number and briefer than those given to women. We know from some work that John Olive and people over in BC did that most participants, this was in a prostate cancer support group, John? So most participants in that group reported that their interactions with physicians were brief. Interestingly, the gender of the practitioners themselves may play a role. So female physicians spend longer with patients than male physicians and spend more time talking about health-related lifestyle and social issues. So it may not just be about whether the guy wants to talk about these, it may be to do with how the physician views whether or not people want to talk about these things and whether these things are important. Maybe male physicians don't see these things as important, whereas female physicians might. Why is that important? This was a case that happened only about 2 weeks ago in the UK. Do you have the phrase man flu here? Man flu? Someone's nodding. Say again? Okay. Whatever she said. So this was an interesting case where a young guy, as you can see from the photo, became unwell, and the paramedic viewed the situation as the guy just having man flu, and the guy died. You know, it's a sad and tragic tale. So in its extreme form, this can be fatal. The views that physicians have around masculinity and men can literally be fatal. So what do men appreciate in communication? We heard a lot of this just before. So some of this will be repeating some of the stuff that Ryan was talking about. But adoption of a frank approach, so concise, direct, and matter-of-fact communication was very much valued. Competence, well, you know, no surprise there. Who wants an incompetent physician? No one. The thoughtful use of humour. I wanted to just pick up on some of the stuff that Ryan was talking about around humour. What I would say is even self-deprecating humour can act to reinforce negative stereotypes if you're not careful. So use of humour is important. Men do like it. What I would say is we need to be careful not to act to reinforce negative stereotypes, though. Empathy, So actually taking time to listen to men. A lot of men who've been engaged in projects, one of the things that they say is it's the first time they've been listened to. One of the most common complaints about young men from socially deprived backgrounds is that no one's ever taken the time to listen to them. And that's tragic. And then prompt resolution of health issues. So there's a bit of research around to show that men quite like forms of engagement that they can do as soon as they want to do it. They're not very patient, perhaps. Not patient patients. Okay. Sticking with some of the stuff around masculinity, one of the other lessons that we've learned is that masculinity can be harnessed to help engage men. So this is what I was trying to say earlier, that not all masculinity is bad. You know, elements and aspects of masculinity have and can be successfully used to engage men. And in fact, it's often crucial to do that in order to get engagement. So we know, for example, this is what we in the UK called rugby on this side. So similar to American football, I guess. But we don't have to have all the padding that you guys have. Pit stop. So pit stop started in Australia. John probably knows a lot more about it than I do. But they utilised car metaphors, going back to Ryan's talk about metaphors. They utilised car metaphors to engage men, thinking that all men like cars. Not all men do. I certainly don't. But, you know, some men do. So good way of engaging men. But some of this also has to be sensitive to other aspects of identity other than just gender. So one of the ways that a lot of men from African American and South Asian communities have been engaged, and I know this is true in the States, I'm pretty sure it's happened in Canada, it's definitely happened in the UK, is through barbershops. So there's been quite a lot of health promotion work done with men from African American communities and South Asian communities using barbershops. So the principles here are all the same, that it's about utilising settings that men feel safe, comfortable, and trusting of in order to do that engagement. The reason that I say we have to take care a bit with this is because of things like this. This was an advert for testicular cancer. I'm still absolutely amazed by it every time I see it.
Now, boys, keep your eyes on me and put one hand down your trousers. But wait, I only want you to touch your testicles. I want you to give them a good feel. Okay. Now, I want you to cup each one in the palm of your hand. Get used to the size and the weight of it. Then gently take it and roll it between your thumb and your forefinger. You're feeling for any unusual lumps or bumps, or more importantly, any recent changes. And it's important to do this regularly. See? It's not that hard, is it? Oh, it is.
So it's interesting, you know, views on that video vary. Some people see it and say, fantastic, best piece of health promotion work I've ever seen. People like me look at it and say, it's a form of soft porn. You know, this is not good, this is just reinforcing all the stuff that we know about objectification of women. If you asked a guy who'd seen it a month or two later, I suspect he would remember it was about testicular cancer. He wouldn't remember any of the advice that was given. But he would remember the woman. She's quite famous in the UK. She was in a club called a group called S Club 7. Did you get that? Well done. So that's Rachel Stevens. You know, so although it's good to utilise aspects of masculinity to engage men, I think we need to be a lot more thoughtful about how, when and where we do that. And that's one of the best examples of why. Okay. So the sixth and final lesson learnt is around the fact that I think, as we've probably already seen over the course of today, masculinity can be a barrier or an enabler in health promotion. We did some review work for Movember. So some of these next quotes are from the review work that we did, looking at the role that masculinity plays in mental health. Come on. So, one of the things that the review found is that there's a strong relationship between adherence to traditional masculinity and poorer mental health help seeking, higher levels of mental health stigma, suicide attempts, and body image concerns. But it's not all of masculinity. So when we looked at the papers in more detail, a lot of these scales have sub-factors. And it seems from the papers that we reviewed that the sub-factor that seemed most damaging was the one around emotional expression. So difficulty in expressing emotions is the element of masculinity most linked to negative mental health help seeking, endorsement of mental health stigma, and likelihood of suicide. So these are the downsides of masculinity, but particularly the downside of difficulties with being emotionally expressive rather than masculinity as a whole. So other aspects, and again this was mentioned briefly earlier, things like feelings of self-esteem, control and responsibility, for example around work and family, were linked to more preventative self-care behaviours and to positive coping with stressful life events. So in other words, these elements of masculinity are actually seen as being quite important. And I know from some of the qualitative work that John Olive's done and other people in Scotland, in the UK, that this aspect of control can be very important in terms of recovery from depression, for example. So not all elements and aspects of masculinity are negative. In fact, some of them are actually health promoting within certain contexts. So this wasn't part of the Movember review. This was a separate paper where Malik and colleagues said that findings suggest that masculinity and the perceived normativeness of other men's behaviours significantly predicted participants' own health behaviours. Beyond that, accounted for by socio-demographic variables. So I think one of the very important things that we need to take away from today is what John MacDonald was telling us this morning, that we need to be very aware of the role that social determinants play. So social determinants are the biggest factor in relation to health outcomes for men and women by a long, long way. Nevertheless, there is an aspect of masculinity that is important above and beyond socio-demographics, and we shouldn't forget that. In relation to this conference particularly, there's very, very recent work, 2015, that states the findings support previous research suggesting that men's endorsement of the male gender role plays a significant role in their desire for an ideal body. So again, elements and aspects of sort of the drive for muscularity or male bodily ideals does play a big role. Okay, how am I doing for time? I'm okay? Good. Part two, which should be a bit quicker than part one. We've actually covered a lot of this. As I said at the beginning, this work derives from two studies that we did. One was a small-scale study where we interviewed, I think it was 11 key men's health practitioners in the UK about what works with men in terms of health promotion. We then did a much larger study, funded by Movember again, that looked at what works for men in relation to mental health, and that was done with colleagues in 5 countries, so the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. And what we used in terms of the method was what I called a multiple hub and spoke. So we had, I think it was 14 people in those 5 countries, not 14 in all 5, 14 in total. But what they did is they reached out into the communities that they knew. Some of these were geographical locations, some of them were specific communities of practice. So one guy reached out into groups of psychotherapists, and they asked them, we provided them with a framework of questions around what works for which men and why in relation to mental health and well-being. So we actually elicited a lot of responses, and colleagues in this room were very active in that process. So John was one of the contacts here in Canada, as was Gilles and Philippe. John MacDonald was one of the contacts in Australia. Don't think there's anyone else in the room that took part. But so that was the method. So what did we find from those 2 studies? We've already heard a little bit about the setting, the importance of the setting. So settings within which interventions take place really are critical in relation to the creation of sort of safe spaces for men. And these safe spaces help reduce stigma, and they facilitate accessible engagement with and for men. So some of the quotes that came out from the work are things like trust is very important to men, and this can begin to be built from the selection of the correct location for a project. Just to give you an example of that, in the UK, and this relates back again to what Ryan was talking about metaphor as well, we had some community psychiatric nurses in the UK that were finding it was very difficult to engage with the men on their caseload in the GP setting. What they did is they moved their service into a soccer club, and they used football metaphor with the men to do the therapeutic work, and that was very successful. So it was about getting the men into a place that felt much more familiar. And just taking a step back, so when we talk about gender and masculinities, these are not just things that are embedded within individuals, they're embedded within structures and institutions. And often GP settings are seen as feminized spaces and places. Soccer grounds, rightly or wrongly, are still viewed very much as male spaces and places. So the way that gender works is not just within an individual, it's institutional as well. So taking that work into the soccer grounds helped the men feel safe and secure, and that was added to by utilising football metaphors within the therapeutic process. The workplace, there's been quite a lot of work done now that shows that the workplace is quite a good arena in which to engage men. It has to be done carefully. If it's done through occupational health departments, it can be seen as policing and not very positive. If it's done by external agencies coming in and working with the men in the workplace, that seems much more acceptable. And interestingly, settings that work best were those selected on the social and cultural identities of the men that they intended to serve. And again, the example of barbershops is one of the ones that was given here, but there's other examples as well. So utilising particular nightclub venues to engage young gay men around sexual health has been very productive. John MacDonald earlier mentioned the sheds. The men's sheds movement has been exceptionally successful in a range of countries, particularly for older and retired men, but not only older and retired men. It's been successful with unemployed men, and it's also been successful in terms of intergenerational work, which is quite important. Again, it's been spoken about earlier a little bit about the style and language. So the style or tone prevailing in community-based strategies is best described as non-hierarchical and non-shaming. So if you can embed projects within the communities that you're trying to serve, in fact, better still, if the projects emerge from that community themselves and the community themselves are demanding that service, then you end up with a very non-hierarchical structure that's much more engaging and embracing. Many men and boys respond to services that have a physical element in which they can let off steam in order to bond with others. I was intrigued listening to Ryan's answer to this before, when he was talking about activity and action as a distraction that gets, if I understood it rightly, it gets men's cognitive guard down and therefore almost sort of tricks them into opening up. I thought John MacDonald's response was fascinating. I definitely agree, John, that it's not just about that. There's real pleasure and joy in engaging in activity. And when you go to some of these soccer-based activities or the sheds, you just feel that joy, that actual physical embodiment of pleasure that goes on in a lot of those projects. You know, so it's not just about tricking men into dropping their guard. It's also about providing them with fun, enjoyment, trust. Of course, you're going to open up more. You know, it's a natural response. This issue of language, I think, warrants some attention. I really like this quote. This is from a feminist lady who runs an organisation trying to prevent men's suicide. And she says, if we've got a door which says for mental health users, then they're probably not going to walk through that door. If we've got a door which says feeling shit, come here, it's a much easier door to walk through. So we have to engage with men in terms of languages that they're familiar with, that they understand. I don't need to say too much more about this. I'm sure, even though I didn't understand the French in John's presentation, I've heard John MacDonald talk about this a lot. You know, one of the things that came out over and over and over again in this work is that if you've not got a love for the boys or the men that you serve in and dealing with and working with, then you better pack up and go home. You know, guys don't want to be patronised. They don't want to be services to be dropped on them or dumped on them. They want to feel that they're being listened to, valued and engaged. And I think it was Ryan that was speaking about the issue of trying to get men then engaged in helping other men within those projects. And again, that came across time and time again, using approaches where men worked alongside other men after they'd been in the project for a while was really important in increasing their sense of self-esteem. So too often service providers start from a position that men are to blame for their predicament and enter into the work with an agenda to fix the problem that is men. For real ownership to be established, it's vital that men are involved from the earliest stage in project development. They must set the agenda and control the project rather than being passive recipients in something that will be seen as organisationally led. So linked to that is this issue of cultivating partnerships. So one of the respondents said partnership working is key. We rarely do things on our own. Some partners see the value of men's health, some don't. It's about how easy we make it for them. So part of what a lot of projects were having to do was to sell the idea of working with men and the positive aspects of working with men to other organisations. But it's important also in terms of sustaining projects that there needs to be mainstream organisations involved from early on. so that they can work alongside the projects, learn from what's going on, and see the advantages of different kinds of approaches. One of the other respondents said it started with external funding. We proved the case and used evidence-based material to present the case, then got permission to mainstream and have formal funding. One of the problems that I'm sure you've seen over here in Canada, we've definitely seen it in the UK. I've been involved in this work now for 20 years, and we see it over and over again. Projects or programs are pump primed with money, say for a 1, 2, or occasionally 3-year period. They stop after that time because there's not been enough thought put into how they're going to be sustained. Okay, final point. Training. It's important that the people delivering interventions understand men. They need proper training and a certain level of understanding. One of the things that I've noticed working in this field for such a long time is that even when practitioners have a desire to work with men, they often feel that they lack the confidence and skills to do it. So training people to understand how best to work with men is actually quite important. Gender-sensitive training is imperative for successful mental health promotion geared towards men. Passion doesn't always result in gender and situational sensitivity. Okay, I'm aware that time's up, so thank you very much for listening. I hope you understood the English. Happy to take any questions. I know people are probably wanting to go home, but I am happy to take questions.
Question, oui? Oui.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was a great presentation. I wonder whether you could, I actually have a very pragmatic question. I wondered if you could just elaborate on what you mean by the strong evidence does exist for sex differences in consultation for psychosocial concerns.
Say that last bit again.
The psychosocial concerns stuff, that there's more evidence that suggests, that there is strong evidence that suggests that there are sex differences.
Yeah, I think it's like I said, there's paper after paper after paper. The reason that I didn't cite any specific papers is because if you do any search for empirical papers that look at sex differences for help seeking in relation to mental health, they nearly all show a sex difference, a significant sex difference.
Okay, all right, great, thanks.
I feel like that a lot of the things you said were true for women too. No one likes to be patronized. Everyone likes to be in an environment where they feel like a human being. I feel like client-centered approaches might solve a lot of problems for both men and women.
But what does client-centered mean?
It means based on their needs and their strengths, instead of the professional imposing their vision of what has to happen.
I think the difficulty is often in community-based work is that you're trying to work with groups of people. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't always make it easy to do individually tailored programs, certainly not in the first instance. So I guess a lot of the projects that we've evaluated are tending to want to serve communities of men. And obviously within that you try to tailor things individually, but what I was most interested in is how do you engage groups of men? Okay. And sure, everyone wants a program that's tailored to them individually. Mm-hmm. But I guess with scarce resources, if you can't get the guys in the first place, you're never going to be able to do a tailored program with them as an individual. So I suppose a lot of these things are taking a step back and say, how do we open the door to these groups of men in the first instance so that we can get them in and do the sort of therapeutic work that Ryan was talking about. One of the things that John and I said immediately after Ryan's talk is that all those hints and tips are perfect once you've got the men through the door. Mm-hmm. The issue is about how do you engage those communities of men.
Thank you.
D'autres questions? I have one. You said earlier that responsibility are linked to more preventative self-care behaviors for men. Do you think in nutrition we can use the fact that they can act as a model for their children to engage in more healthier behaviors? Do you think we can do that?
Yeah, definitely. We've just finished doing a project in a very deprived area of Manchester in the UK that was called Salford Dads. And what that project did is it used what's called a positive deviance model. So it looked for men who were fathers in that community who were very engaged with the children, and it tried to utilise, well, it did. It utilised those guys to spread those thoughts, ideas and behaviours through the community. So at the end of a 2-year period, there were upwards of 50 men involved in various activities that are linked to Salford Dads. The dads themselves, a group of 11 of them, have now formally constituted as a group within that community. And the organisation called Unlimited Potential that was doing the work is slowly stepping away, because the idea was always that the men themselves would get the momentum. And the changes that have been reported, not only by the men, but we also did empirical work with the women in the community to find out what they thought about the changes, and the children. And the work with the children just made me cry reading it. You know, they described not only more time with their fathers, but such a massive improvement in the quality of that time with their fathers. They also described better relationships between the father and the mother, even when that father and mother were no longer together. They'd seen a lot of improvements in the relationship. So definitely you can use role models.
Thank you. Oui, yes.
Looking for what's wrong with people and fixing it. The example you just gave us of working on what we classically call a strength-based approach. Yeah? Just looking at those guys, and I know Salford, I lived just next to it for some years, but to actually look for the guys, the fathers who are doing it well, and then building on that, I think that's exactly what we need to be listening to. Building on the strengths, s'appuyer sur les forces des pères en ce cas. I think it's splendid, and I realise now that's why when he speaks so often, I feel at ease. I want to say thank you for that.
Thank you, John.
Yes.
I feel very at ease with you too.
Oui.
Est-ce que le micro fonctionne?
Oui.
Ah, oui,
You'll need to speak very loud, Jill. I'm very
Okay.
hard of hearing.
Yeah. Maybe a good example of what you said is what we have done in Quebec about suicide prevention. We had a raising rate of suicide in Quebec from the 80s till the end of 90s. And it was incredible, especially between men. It was quite the same for women, but men always increasing. And at the end of 90s and the beginning of 200s, we just decided in Quebec to focus more on men, and especially in a positive way. So we try to men more aware of that, and to know that we need that they stay alive. And so we had a big campaign at that time called "It's Strong to Ask for Help." We just write about it in some article. So, and it's very interesting because now we have a third less rate of suicide in Quebec. In the last 10 years, we achieved good things about that topic, and I think it's very interesting when we look at this question. 10, maybe 15 years ago, I think it was about 80% of the calls in the suicide prevention centers were from women. Now it's half and half, men and women, which is quite normal, because when you look at data, usually to have strong ideas of suicide, it's almost the same between men and women. So it's normal to have half and half, men and women, to call for help. So it's quite a good idea when you just have a good way to reach men we can achieve.
Yeah, I know when you very kindly invited me to come to Quebec, I was very impressed and moved by a lot of the work that was going on there,
Yes.
for sure. I certainly learnt a lot from the visit.
Dernière chance pour des questions? Yes? Mhm.
So thanks for the presentation, and I really appreciated your coverage of some of the history at the beginning of where the field has gone in terms of in the mid-90s doing a lot more essentializing, talking a lot more about the negatives. And Ryan touched upon some of this too, really acknowledging lots of the variation and that kind of men as a group, there are lots of differences in terms of how masculinity gets done in both good ways and in both bad ways.
Yeah.
And so wondering how we take that knowledge to designing interventions that are able to hit upon some of that variation in how men do gender, because it's tricky. And I think you were just touching upon it a little bit with the group approach versus the individual approach, and wondering if there's a balanced way to those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a balanced way. I think it's like the answer I gave to the lady before. It's you know, if you can't engage the men to start with, you can't do the more psychotherapeutic work. So I guess a lot of the stuff that I focus on is that wider engagement, and it's great, you know, for other people like yourself and Ryan to be focusing much more on the actual consultation sort of part of it all. What I've presented is only a snapshot. We did produce earlier this year the full report from the Movember work, and that details a lot of those areas more. And I think there was around about 8 sort of key points that they're not a recipe for success in terms of, you know, follow this and it will definitely work. They're 8 sort of underlying guiding principles that will help you have a successful community-based project or program with men. So they have to be interpreted, those principles have to be interpreted differently depending on the communities of men that you're engaging. But I would highly recommend taking a look at the Movember report that we've produced and looking at those sort of things. And the thing that stood out for me from that probably most is that the more of those you do, and the more you integrate those various elements together, the more successful it will be. There seems to be a synergistic effect. I don't know what the French for synergy is. So there's more, it's more than just a cumulative effect. If you can put those principles into practice, there's an effect that's above and beyond just adding them.
D'autres questions? Non? Thank you very much.
Thank
Monsieur
you.
Mitterrand.